The history of the British Empire spans several centuries and is one of the most significant and influential chapters in world history. It saw the rise of Britain as a dominant global power, establishing colonies and trading networks across every continent. The legacy of the British Empire remains complex and controversial, with its impact still being felt in many parts of the world today. Early beginnings, the Age of Exploration, 15th–17th century. The origins of the British Empire can be traced to the Age of Exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. During this period, European nations, including Spain, Portugal, and later, Britain, began exploring new trade routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Britain's first ventures into overseas expansion began with maritime exploration and trade. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian explorer sailing under the English flag, reached North America, claiming the land for England. This marked the beginning of English involvement in the exploration of the New World. However, it wasn't until the early 17th century that Britain began to establish colonies in earnest. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was one of the first major British ventures overseas. Initially created for trade with the East Indies, it eventually expanded its influence in India, which would become a key part of the British Empire. The 17th century, colonization of the Americas and the rise of trade. The 17th century saw the establishment of several British colonies, particularly in North America and the Caribbean. British settlers established colonies in Virginia, 1607, Massachusetts, 1620, and other parts of what would later become the United States. At the same time, Britain began to dominate the transatlantic slave trade, which played a significant role in the economy of its American colonies. The Caribbean islands, including Jamaica and Barbados, became important sources of wealth for Britain through sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. British influence in the region grew, as the empire expanded its control over profitable trade routes and resources. The 18th century, expansion and conflict. The 18th century saw Britain expand its empire through a series of wars, notably the Seven Years' War, 1756–1763, which resulted in British victory over France and Spain. As a result, Britain gained significant territories, including Canada, Florida, and parts of India. During this period, Britain's economic and naval power grew, establishing it as one of the world's leading superpowers. The Industrial Revolution, late 18th to early 19th century, further strengthened Britain's position, providing the country with a strong economic base to fund the expansion of its empire. In India, the British East India Company exercised control, particularly after the Battle of Plassey, 1757, which marked the beginning of direct British rule in the region. British control over India was formalized in 1858 after the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. The 19th century. The British Empire at its height. The 19th century is often considered the imperial century of British history, as the British Empire reached its height. This period, known as the Victorian era, saw Britain dominate vast parts of the world, including large swaths of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, became a symbol of the empire's power and reach. The empire expanded through a combination of military conquest, diplomacy, and economic exploitation. British control over India, which had begun under the East India Company, was formalized when the British Crown took direct control after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Britain also expanded into Africa during this period, driven by the Scramble for Africa, 1880–1914. British imperial ambitions were further solidified through the establishment of colonies like Egypt, South Africa, and Kenya. Meanwhile, in the Pacific and Caribbean, Britain continued to maintain control over key territories, such as New Zealand, Australia, and various islands. The British Empire also expanded into the Pacific Islands, with Fiji and the Solomon Islands coming under British control. The 20th century. Decline and World Wars. The 20th century saw the decline of the British Empire, particularly after the two world wars. While Britain was a dominant power at the beginning of the century, the toll of the wars severely weakened its global position. World War I, 1914-1918, and World War II, 1939-1945, caused widespread destruction across Europe and disrupted Britain's ability to maintain control over its colonies. During and after World War II, movements for independence gained momentum in British colonies, particularly in India, Africa, and the Middle East. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India, marking the end of the British Raj and the beginning of the decolonization process. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 divided British India into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan. This event marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire in Asia. Following World War II, Britain was increasingly unable to maintain its colonial holdings due to economic strains and the rise of nationalist movements. Independence movements in Africa gained strength, leading to the eventual decolonization of many territories, including Ghana, 1957, Kenya, 1963, and Zimbabwe, 1980. In the Caribbean, British control also waned, with many nations gaining independence in the 1960s and 1970s. The decline of the empire accelerated as the British government increasingly focused on its domestic issues and its role within international organizations like the United Nations. The last major territory to gain independence from Britain was Hong Kong, which was handed back to China in 1997. Legacy of the British Empire. The legacy of the British Empire is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, the empire facilitated global trade, spread English language and culture, and contributed to advancements in infrastructure, education, and governance in many parts of the world. British legal systems, parliamentary democracy, and institutions have had a lasting influence on many former colonies. On the other hand, the empire was built on exploitation, including the forced labor of enslaved Africans, economic exploitation, and the suppression of indigenous cultures and peoples. Many former colonies still struggle with the lasting effects of colonialism, including economic disparities, political instability, and the effects of arbitrary borders drawn by imperial powers. The British Empire's role in global history remains a subject of debate and reflection. While some view it as a force for good, others emphasize the negative aspects of colonization and imperialism. Conclusion: the history of the British Empire is one of remarkable expansion, power, and influence, but it also encompasses profound consequences for the countries and peoples affected by British rule. The empire's decline in the 20th century was a reflection of changing global dynamics, the rise of independence movements, and the challenges of maintaining control over a vast and diverse empire. Today, the legacy of the British Empire continues to shape the world in numerous ways, and its story remains one of the most important in the history of global politics and colonialism.